This is Ayesha Siddiqa with Neighbors Talking for Naya Daur TV. Today we have with us Kabir Taneja, who is a fellow with Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation looking at West Asia and India. He's definitely somebody whose comments on social media I look at for my own building my own understanding of West Asia. So welcome Kabir to Neighbors Talking.
Thank you so much.
And today, as you know, as we discussed before, we are going to talk about Middle East and South Asia, especially India, and perhaps India and Pakistan. Um, how do you look at the Middle East? I mean, how do you see, strategically, how does Middle East look to you from India?
See, that's a very good question because if you see it from a slightly historical perspective, during the 50s and the 60s, there was a lot of bonhomie between India and certain Middle East countries on the back of non-aligned movement and, India being a new democracy in the world and wanting to sort of plant its own flag of how it saw diplomacy, how it saw international affairs, which to a certain extent was reinvigorated again this time when we were discussing the Russia-Ukraine war, and a lot of people were not able to understand what India's stance was. So a lot of history that India has, a lot of diplomatic history that India has actually has taken the Middle East as a region with it over the past few decades. But when it comes to sort of the deliverables and when it comes to the modalities of what kind of relationship India has had, it has largely been for the longest part about the Indian diaspora that works in the Middle East, energy security. The Indian diaspora is almost 7 million people strong. That's about the
All right.
population of Sweden or
Okay.
Finland. So those have been the
And this is in
driving.
the Middle East. This
Yeah.
is
This is
7
just
million. Okay.
just in the Middle East, and but now it has changed. One of the driving factors today is that India looks at the certain Gulf countries such as the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia as potential investment destinations. They want these countries to invest in India into Indian infrastructure projects, into Indian ports, into Indian IT technology, or what you may. So that's been a major shift over the past couple of years, and a lot of it actually has been led by a very sort of personalized view of the region by Prime Minister Modi. I think there's a lot of questions of how does it work, considering Prime Minister Modi comes from a Hindu nationalist party, and of course his arguably one of the most successful outreaches have been to the Islamic world in the Gulf.
In
So
fact, this was, sorry to cut you, but this is
yeah,
where
yeah.
I was also headed. This ideological kind of, in a way, the two poles really, the Muslim world, Muslim Arab world,
Yeah.
and in India. I mean, I'm reminded of when in 1950s after 47. In fact, India would supply Indian currency was used in a lot of these Gulf countries and even in Saudi Arabia, and that was that was disrupted. India stopped it somewhere in the mid 1950s,
Yeah.
and I was reading some of the archives here in the British Library, and I there was one comment by a British diplomat saying, and I'll quote from it, that Pandit Nehru is obsessed with the fear of Islamic encirclement, unquote. Um, so, how has Narendra Modi, coming from, a totally opposite, Pandit Nehru was secular,
Yeah.
Narendra Modi is not. How has he managed to reach out?
That's a very good question again, because I think it's for the longest period of time, even when India wanted to reach out in the Gulf, let's say in the 1990s, and let's
Right.
take terrorism and counterterrorism as an example. Post the Bombay bombings in early 90s and so on and so forth, we saw images, for example, like Dawood Ibrahim sitting in Sharjah watching cricket and having fun with no consequences, right? At that time, even if India wanted to reach out to, let's say, to the UAE and say, like, look, this is a very wanted person, we would like your cooperation on that, that was never going to happen. And that predominantly only comes because of the reason now that India is of a certain economic size. I think there is a realization in the oil producing countries, specifically in the Gulf, that the future market of selling that oil now lies in Asia. Right. So it's China,
Okay.
Japan, South Korea, and India. And India imports 86% of its oil annually, and majority of that 86% comes from the Gulf. Right. So India is a
Okay.
critical importer of that oil. And I think that geopolitical reorientation of how countries like the UAE and Saudi have historically viewed India changed because of economic conditions. It was a forced change, in my opinion. And
But that happened before Narendra Modi. That
yeah,
happened
yeah. I
under
mean,
the
it
Manmohan government.
started happening before Modi, right? It got more pace under Modi's leadership, and one of the reasons why is because after a long period of time, India got a majoritarian government. So decision making was fast, something that resonates very well with Gulf monarchies. Not many projects were stuck in cooperative government structures where we saw, for example, how the US nuclear deal was argued in the Indian Parliament in 2007 2008. That whole
Hmm.
cash thing. So none of that is happening now. So sort of the buck stops with the prime minister, and that is a very sort of inviting proposition for the Gulf countries to do business in. Right. So they know that if they go, they want to, let's say, set up, hypothetically, let's say they want to set up a port in Maharashtra or in Gujarat. They know that it can, the time it will take for that project to get cleared is considerably less now to what it used to be. And that is because they have to approach the prime minister's office and the work gets done there, and that is very similar to sort of
Right.
how they operate in the Gulf. Right. There is sort
Right.
of
Right. Right.
no bureaucracy in the middle kind of deal. So these two factors, they find they find Delhi at this point of time very similar to how they operate. The getting decisions done is easier now than it what used to be in coalition governments under the UPA, NDA before that, and so on. So that's a major thing that Prime Minister Modi has capitalized on during his outreach to West Asia.
So the question which I've been trying to find answer, and I've spoken to several Indian diplomats who have served in the Middle East. The question, and I'm going to repeat that to you, that how did India manage to kind of push back the Pakistan factor in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states? Pakistan had these very important security relations. So how was that minimized?
Look again. I think the just the very fact that India's certain economic size became much more palatable to Gulf monarchies. Because look, fine, they have very close relations to Pakistan, and I always say that that's something that India has not broken. Right? It's not a
Okay.
broken relationship. It's taken a backseat because, okay, fine, you can deal with Pakistan on a strategic level, you can deal with Pakistan on military levels, but not so much on
Right.
economic levels, right? I mean, there are severe limitations on what the Gulf Sovereign Fund or the Qatari Sovereign Fund can do in Pakistan at this point of time, or over the past couple of
Okay.
years. Contrarily, not so much in India, right? I mean, if you see the UAE is already looking to heavily invest in areas such as edtech and these new sort of places where they realize where these industries are going to be critical to them in a post oil world as well, right? Which is still
Right.
some
Right.
time away, but they're moving in that direction. And to facilitate this, for example, during the height of the tensions between the US and Saudi Arabia, the Khashoggi affair, and so on and so forth,
Hmm.
despite the criticism and all that, India still hosted MBS in New Delhi, albeit in
Right.
a low key sort of thing, and not for a long period of time. I think it lasted just a day. But that, those kind of gestures of India's certain level of neutrality and interest based approach when it comes to its its foreign policy, is something that again the Gulf is able to capitalize on. So when no one was inviting MBS Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman anywhere in the world, especially in the West, India still hosted him in New Delhi. So these overtures, along with the potential of future economic development and cooperation, is something which is very critical to a region now looking to divest from its reliance on petrodollars, and
Right, right,
to build future industries that are going to sustain it on the same level as it is sustaining itself today. So they can't go back, right? They have to move forward. For that, they need great returns on their investments, and there are very few
right.
places right now where you can go for that. You can come to India till a certain level, you can go to China still. I'm not sure how that's going to pan out in the next 2 3 years though, but beyond that, again, there are severe limitations of where you can go.
You know,
So India,
I would
yeah,
ask you to hold your thoughts on India, China, in the Middle East.
sure,
But
sure, yeah.
before that, let me ask you this question. I mean, we know from recently what had happened. The all of this, tamasha of sorts when one of the BJP members made a statement, and the whole thing, their reaction from the Middle East. So ideology, while ideology has been pushed back, it's still there. So, where do you think what is India's capacity to kind of hold back on ideology?
Look, I think, I mean, ideology, holding back on things like ideology was much easier earlier. In the world of social media and hyperconnection, it becomes much more difficult.
Right.
We saw that those comments made in a certain aspect on a television channel which has nothing to do with the government's official position or as part of its foreign policy, but because the person in question was a representative of the ruling party,
Right.
it got
Right.
blown out of proportion. And I say blown out of proportion because I personally think that if, for example, the Qataris, who were the first to sort of bring it up at a bilateral and a bigger sort of international level, if they wouldn't have done so, I
Hmm.
don't think the others in the Gulf would have followed. I think we may have seen some statements from, let's say, Kuwait and so on and so forth, who have raised issue of Kashmir also previously in their parliament discussions and so on. But this would have not been that big a deal, because if you read the statements that the others, such as the United Arab Emirates, released later, they are
Hmm.
fairly they're fairly watered down in nature, right? So they recognize the fact that okay, that was a problematic statement, but also sort of padded it around by saying, look, these kind of things happen, India
Hmm.
has a very
Hmm.
good
Hmm.
Gulf, so on and so forth. So it was a domino effect, in my opinion. If
Okay.
that first step wouldn't have been taken by Doha, I don't think many countries would have come out with such a visceral response.
Yeah, but that competition within the Arab world, within the Gulf, is going to continue between Doha and Dubai or Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
That's also the future. Um, where do you see the China-India competition in the Gulf and in the Middle East?
Look, first and foremost, I think a lot of the sort of China coming into as a stopgap in the Gulf, specifically under the this argument that US is a receding power, or US,
Right.
their influence in the Gulf is waning, and China is a replacement, quote unquote. I think that's a hedge mostly by the Gulf states themselves. I don't think China sees itself like that. Even if you see, I mean, we know even if we've seen that, okay, fine, the US did not sell drones to the UAE, they bought
Hmm.
Winglong drones from China. So like it's on
Right.
that level, right? So it's very transactional in nature at this point of time. Even if you see their strategic, that deal they signed with Iran, where this very big numbers are thrown around, 400 billion, 350 billion, and
Hmm.
so on and so forth. Most of those numbers were coming from Iranian sources. The Chinese did not come
Right.
out, step forward and said, we are going to invest $250 billion in Iran over the next 5 years, right? So I think China realizes it's being used as a hedge by Gulf states, and it works in its favor. Why not? The Chinese companies also need to go around the world if they want to continue doing business, which is going to get harder. after
Right.
the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I think, look, from an Indian point of view, if you see, India has, after Galwan crisis in 2020, the perception of China has drastically changed here. And we
Has it?
see, yeah, yeah, it's just, I mean, look, realistically, we are still doing big trade with them, right?
Hmm.
And that trade is going to continue, because decoupling on economy will affect Indian economy as well. You can't just do it
Yeah,
overnight.
yeah, yeah.
But the perception of for example, it's a festival season in India right now. There's so many people on WhatsApp and so on, you know, saying that we go to markets and ask, "Ye China, is this from China or is this not from China?" And they prefer to
Oh,
get
okay.
something that's not made from China. So it's become ingrained into the Indian psyche kind of situation. And that reflects into how India sees China dealing with other countries that it deals with. But in a realistic sense, of course, India is a $5 trillion economy, just about. China is a $17 trillion economy. Uh,
Right.
uh, on a face-to-face basis, India cannot take on China in places like the Middle East or Africa, on a dollar-to-dollar basis. But it is
Okay.
trying. Yeah, it is trying very. It is trying to sort of provide itself as part of alliances such as I2U2, or with its cooperation with Europe and the US, as an alternative to everything and anything that the Chinese are offering.
Let me also take you to another question, which is that, in terms of, well, on the one hand, there is India China competition of sorts, but then there is a very underlying India Pakistan competition as well. Again, they're not comparative. For example, in the defense sector, where Pakistan still has a hold, Pakistan has communication, there have often been suggestions that Indian military would like to reach out, would have conversations. One kind of very carefully from Pakistan look at whenever there visits, um, defense visits from India to the Middle East, and vice versa. Where do you see that going?
Look, I will not be surprised if, in a very slow and crawled manner, some kind of outreach is conducted over the next couple of years, maybe. But also totally depends on political dispensations here and there. We're very fragile to basically, freeze everything if something changes either in Islamabad or something changes in Delhi. But the one thing that has happened right now, Pakistan is not the central issue in Indian public psyche anymore, in my opinion. I think a lot has
Okay.
changed on that front. Of course, terrorism and sponsoring of terrorism and those issues are continuing. That's something that India keeps on raising at the correct forums. But other than that, I think that overarching realization, like, okay, fine, Pakistan is there, they're our neighbor, that's a reality. We will deal with Pakistan as and when required. We saw the Pakistani delegations, for example, coming here for counter-terror meetings as part of the
Right.
SCO, right? So that happened, and there was, of course, people raised questions, that why are you doing this, but there was no sort of hue and cry about it,
But what
because
about the Middle East? What about in the Middle East?
look, I mean, India's approach in the Middle East, on the defense part, is of course now growing slightly, that we want to be an exporter also. We saw Minister Jaishankar's visit to Cairo, for example, and around that visit, there was this big sort of hue and cry again about India trying to sell the Tejas aircraft to Egypt, which was never
Right.
not really going to happen. But there is this massive push by New Delhi right now that you need to build our domestic industries. And the Gulf is seen as a natural sort of partner to both jointly develop projects, which has been suggested in the past, in the recent past, but also as a potential sales market. But when it comes to the fundamentals of Pakistan's, let's say, relations with the Saudis on defense issues, that's a very concrete understanding, right? In the sense that
Okay.
you can have fallouts, you can have disagreements between Riyadh and Islamabad, uh,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
but any sort of long term idea that India's popularity in the Gulf has broken that fold, and I think is a misjudgment. But that does not mean that the Saudis are not going to look at India as defense partners, right? For example,
No, no, but
uh,
what partnership would that, what would it entail?
the relationship between India and the Gulf on the
Yeah,
defense
yeah,
aspect.
yeah.
Look, at the moment, whatever that is going to be transactional. But but the thing that we have observed over the past 5 years, 5 to 6 years, is a drastic increase in joint military exercises, and that is
Okay,
largely coming from the fact that India is now realizing it is going to become more and more responsible for its own security interests in the Gulf. So, for example, if your ships are traversing through the Strait of Hormuz, and there are
okay,
tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Indians are then going to become responsible for the protection of their own ships. Right. So
okay.
Operation Sankalp, for example, was an operation by the Indian Navy started in 2019. It evolved out of Indian Navy's deployment against piracy near the African
Hmm.
coast, but
Okay.
then evolved into basically Indian Navy, guiding Indian flagged oil tankers from the Strait of Hormuz towards the Indian shores in a safe manner. So,
But
hmm.
yeah, but it's not going to happen that if Bahrain, for example, has a problem, internal problem, and it needs, for example, security personnel, that India is going to dispatch.
That look
Uh,
that is yeah that's not going to happen, but when we are talking about, let's say, on that granular level of defense cooperation, India is not going to be a country is going to deploy boots on any of the grounds, right? So naval
okay,
is much more easier because you can anchor off land, and it doesn't cause any sort of problems as far as public perception of Indian foreign policy goes. But if there is sort of any sort of thing like what Turkey does with Qatar, sort of this deployment in Qatar, and so on and so forth, that is not going to happen. That was a big debate, even in a country like Afghanistan, that India should
right,
should
right.
do, which was much more critical to India's security requirements at that point of time than anyone in the Gulf at this point of time. And even then, India did not go down that path, despite a lot of pressure from certain quarters. So that is not going to happen. Yeah.
So let me ask you this, kind of in a way, a last question, which is that, in fact, two questions. One is that where do you see, I mean, in this growing US China tension, what role do you see the Middle East playing? And do you see then a future partnership
Yeah.
uh, between India and the Middle East on that? Um, that's one question. And
Mm.
secondly, and I think that for me that's an important question which you can answer, is that how do you see the Middle East evolving? I mean, these are countries which have found new economic strength, new economic zeal, new leadership, new direction. Yet there is an underlying creeping instability as well. So how do you look at that?
Yeah. All right. So on the first one, I think, look, both India and countries in the Gulf specifically, some countries in the Gulf specifically, are trying this model of strategic autonomy, right? To sort of make your cake and eat it as well.
Hmm.
It's much more original thought to India, because it's been trying to practice that for a long period of time. But now we are seeing sort of the Gulf countries also realizing that they cannot be seen just in the American camp. They want to deal
Okay.
with Russia on energy. They want to deal with China on economics, and they also have to then balance out of their security relationship with the US, which is contentious but very critical to their security architecture. Now, how that
Right.
is going to take place, I think I mean, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
Like we've seen the recent sort of tussle between Saudi Arabia and the US over
Hmm.
Saudi
Hmm.
Arabia's
Yeah.
Pegasus system, and Russia dealing with Russia, and so on and so forth. But despite that diplomatic fracas, we are still seeing statements being made that that does not affect the security arrangements between Saudi Arabia and the US. So I think the US may have to respect at some level that, the Saudis, as they are diversifying away from oil, which is a very difficult thing to do for a country like Saudi Arabia, that they
Hmm.
will require a little bit more strategic autonomy, and that
Right.
strategic autonomy's requirement should be respected. Because, if you
Okay.
see everything from a black and white binary, that with us against us, that argument does not sell very well in India, and I don't think that sells very well in the Gulf either. So,
Okay.
yeah. So I think maybe some sort of leeway from Washington to allow countries like Saudi Arabia, who are on a very, very difficult path of both trying to propagate a more modern view of
Hmm.
Islam,
Hmm.
and trying to sort of wean away from petrodollars, which fund a lot of their domestic demands, especially with the population, with a very young
Okay.
population.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a sort of more understanding from the US, I think, would be helpful. Um,
Right.
uh, and on your second, sorry, I completely sort of blanked out on the second question.
No,
What
no.
was it?
This, the second one was like, where do you see the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, for example, developing politically? But because there are new
Right, right,
goals, new aspirations, yet there
right.
is, an underlying instability.
Yeah, no,
There were traditional societies. So how will, for example, MBS ensure that people stick to his new plan of modernization?
look, I think that's a very good question, and that's what I was saying. A lot rides on it, which is why countries that are working with Saudi Arabia, such as the US, the European countries, even India, and others, are supporting the Saudi move towards a more moderate pitch, but are also, very aware of the fact that it can backfire.
Okay.
That which is why the support is there, but also, it's not a complete sort of this is a done and dusted deal. It's a process, it's a very precarious process, and we'll have to wait and watch sort of how that goes. Because, if you see, when we talk about the Gulf doing well, the Gulf doing economically well, we're talking about basically Saudi Arabia, UAE, and maybe Qatar. Right. If you see, Lebanon is in shambles right now. You see Iraq, we have seen, regularly a very sort of politically fragile environment, with larger roles being played by Iran and Saudi Arabia rather than the Iraqi polity. And the others, of course, Jordan and some other countries are doing all right. But when we are talking about, economic uh, economic speedy economic development in the Gulf, we are largely only talking about the UAE, Saudi, and maybe one more country.
Okay.
So
All right.
we don't talk about the others much. So we have to keep that eye, because most of, I mean, Syria is still not a stable country. Iraq is not necessarily a fully stable
Sure.
country. Lebanon at this point of time is economically not there. They don't have anything. And they rely on all these, they rely on the UAE and Saudi for their own sort of benefits looking forward. So a lot lies only on these one or two variables in the Gulf. So it is very, it is very, again, precarious of, and maybe an unsustainable model for the long term. So that will have to be looked at.
Thank you, Kabir Taneja, for joining me on Neighbors Talking. Indeed, Middle East and the Gulf is a very important region for South Asia. Let's see what the future holds for both of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiqa. Thank you.